So when we proclaim the name of Jesus, power is released.
Welcome to New Dawn Community Church, the message of the week with Pastor Randall Cutter.
Okay, we are in Luke chapter 7 today, so if you open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 7, you'll have an opportunity to be somewhere in the vicinity of what we're doing today. And what are we doing today? Well, today we're looking at two stories of encounters that Jesus had, which reveal a little bit about his heart. Both stories are about a need that someone had. Both of them involved either death or the potential for death, and Jesus responds to them. Now, throughout this entire thing, I want you to remember, Jesus always said that he only did what he saw the Father doing. Which means in both of these events, the Lord had primed him, the Father had primed him ahead of time, so that he would understand that he was supposed to be involved in these things. It's interesting because of the fact that both of them are a little different. So, I've entitled today's message, Luke is obviously using it to point out that Jesus as Messiah is doing some incredible things. In fact, at the end of the second story, the people are talking about the great prophet and God visiting them. There's no doubt they're realizing just who Jesus was at that time. It's one of the reasons the religious leaders got so uptight about Jesus, because the common folks were looking at what Jesus was doing and recognizing who he was. And so, today, we're looking at a theme, the Messiah responding to human need, to desperate human need. Because that's what's confronting us today. We're in Luke chapter 7. We are looking at the first story, starting with verse 1. Just a reminder, the translation which we project is my translation of the Greek New Testament. It's always good for you to have your favorite translation open in front of you, whether it's on an electronic device or whether it is your favorite version of the Bible. And someone asked me, do I have a version? Yeah, the translations that I'm doing. No, we are many, many books of the Bible away from that. And what I've got is what you see, or on my blog if I've published it. So Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. When he, meaning Jesus of course, when he had finished all his teaching in front of the people, he went to Capernaum. There a certain centurion had a servant who was ill and was about to die. The servant was dear to him. When he heard about Jesus, he sent Jewish elders to Jesus, asking that he might come and heal his servant. So, we are introduced to what happened after the Sermon on the Plain. In the book of Luke, it highlights the same type of teachings that Jesus did on the Sermon on the Mount, but he did them to his disciples, and he applied them specifically to disciples rather than to the whole crowds. And so he finished that message last week in our study. We saw the end of it. And now it says, what did he do after it? When he had finished all his teaching in front of the people, the disciples, this larger group of disciples, he headed back to Capernaum. Remember that Capernaum was his base of operations. And there was a centurion, and Luke calls him a certain centurion. Most of your translations get rid of the word certain, because it's our word, when we just say a centurion, that's a certain centurion. But he actually does say a certain centurion had a servant who was ill and was about to die. So, this centurion probably, it was in Galilee, so he worked for Herod. He was a centurion, probably a Roman centurion that Herod had been able to get from the Romans, who was in charge of a troop of 100. That's why it was called a century, around 100. They were always obviously short and just like any other military group. And this centurion could have been in charge of policing in that area on Herod's behalf. More than likely, it was some kind of customs duty he was in charge of and watching over that sector where he was actually making money for Herod. He obviously had some wealth, and centurions normally didn't have a lot of wealth. And so, they had money, but they didn't have what we hear about him in just a few minutes. And so he did have wealth, which means he may have been involved in that customs area But he was a righteous man. That's clear from the entire context. So it would not have been an extortion thing like anyone else that he was involved in. So anyway, he was a centurion. He had a servant who was ill, and the servant was dear to him. The Greek word is slave, but we can't use that word without our understanding of the import of that word. So most often we translate it servant because that's really, someone could become a slave in that culture through economic need, short-term contracts. It just meant that it was someone who you didn't have to pay to be a part of your household, but you supported them and took care of them. And then when they got to the end of their contract term, they would no longer be a slave. Sometimes they were impressed into slavery because of financial issues or whatever, but very often, especially in this case, the centurion had this servant, and he was very dear to him. It was very common to have your head household servant be a close personal friend, and for this centurion, that obviously was the case. Very important person to him. He was ill and was about to die, and the centurion didn't want him to die because he was a close personal friend. It wasn't because he was an investment. It was because he was a close personal friend, very dear to him. And when he heard about Jesus, he sent Jewish elders to Jesus to ask that he might come and heal his servant. By the way, if you remember this story from the book of Matthew, it says that Matthew just shortens it. He abbreviates the account. And Matthew says he came to Jesus. Well, he did. He came through his intermediaries. And so if you read the book of Matthew, you could draw the conclusion, but it would be you drawing a conclusion, that he was there in person. He wasn't there in person. He sent the intermediaries, and we find out why in just a little bit. So he sent the Jewish elders to meet with Jesus. And the Jewish elders, probably the Jewish elders that were in charge of taking care of Capernaum, like the city commission, or the ones who were the most, the ones who did the things in Capernaum that made sure that things operated. They, of course, would have been in close contact with the centurion, and because he was a righteous centurion and was doing things to benefit the city, they, of course, wanted to keep him happy. And so they came to Jesus when he was there. This is verses 4 and 5. When the elders arrived by Jesus, they earnestly appealed to him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our people, and he is the one who built the synagogue for us." So we find out he had some financial ability because he built the synagogue, and we find out that they really appreciated him. They knew the centurion loved their people. Now, the elders themselves, they're trapped in the value system of their time, because they don't come to Jesus as people had come to him again and again throughout his ministry. Have mercy on us, help and entreat him. They come to Jesus and they try to convince him based upon the centurion's worthiness. And that means they were firmly in the grips of the normal human value system. Why should you help this person? Because he's helped us. Why should you help this person? Because he's a nice person. No, why should you help this person? Because we're asking that you do it out of mercy. See, when we come before God, remember, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had just taught a version of the Sermon on the Mount to his disciples, but in the Sermon on the Mount, it's blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. The Greek word there is ptochos. It means like dirt poor. It means the person that doesn't have two nickels to rub together. None of us are ptochos poor. Spiritually, that's where we start. But financially, we're just, hopefully we've never been in a place in our entire lives that we were ptochos poor, because it'd be bad. But Jesus is saying in spirit, because we recognize not only don't we have any currency to offer, in most cases when you're that poor, you have debt. And that's why he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, because they recognize their absolute need of God's mercy. And so the Jewish elders come to Jesus and they say, hey, this guy is worthy. That's exactly the wrong thing to say to Jesus. It's the wrong thing to say to God. Their approach stunk. Jesus, we should have had a section of Scripture here where Jesus looks at them and says, no one is worthy. And he turns around until they come on their knees and say, whatever. But that's not what happened. They're trapped in a human value system saying he is worthy. And I mean, the guy was a nice guy. He loved the people and he built the synagogue. But their idea of why Jesus should help them was wrong. And the centurion knew it too. So, the amazing thing is then Jesus started on his way with them. That's why I said before, by the way, that Jesus only did what he saw the Father doing. This is a pretty good indication. The Father said, you're going to get this weird entreaty today, go along with it. Then Jesus started on his way with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends who said to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you come under my roof. For this very reason I did not consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. Do you hear the difference in attitude? It's an amazing difference in attitude. Jesus does respond to the need. He hears that there's a need. He is going to demonstrate his life and his power, and obviously he was going to do what the Father showed him, and he was going to, go forward. And then we find out about the centurion's understanding of his. The centurion wasn't saying, he should help me because I'm worthy. In fact, the centurion said, I didn't come to you in person because I did not feel worthy. That's an amazing thing for this man to say. He was a military leader and very important in the community, and said, but I understand this Jewish-Gentile thing, and I understand the messianic implications. I understand all that, and I am just simply going to send others to ask the questions for me, because I do not want to do something that would seem to dishonor you. And that's a heart. The individual was more concerned about any dishonor that he could bring to Jesus than he was about any dishonor that might fall upon himself for his approach. So he did not consider himself worthy to even approach Jesus. So the elders were saying, hey, come lay hands on the servant. And Jesus is coming along, and the centurion hears about it. They got close to the house, and he sent out some friends that were in the house and said, please tell him he doesn't have to come. Give him, he put the words in their mouth so that they would be able to say it. And he gets to the end, and he says, say the word. He sends that message to Jesus. Just say the word right where you are, and my servant will be healed. That's a, wow. Well, you know what happens next. Because we know the story pretty well. Jesus is amazed by what happens. But let's get to what he said the rest of the way. For I also am a man deployed under authority, having soldiers under me. I say to this one, go, and he goes, to another, come, and he comes. To my servant do this, and he does it. And so now Jesus gets the fullness. He said, just say the word and the man will be healed. And here this guy is saying this. He says, by the way, and this is a man who is he understood military chain of command because he was deployed. He was underneath a military chain of command. And he got orders, and he gave orders. He understood fully what it meant to receive orders, and he understood fully what it meant to give orders and have them obeyed. He obeyed some orders, and others obeyed him. Some obeyed him. And so he understood authority. He said, Jesus, if you just say the word, that's all it's going to take, and the people, the beings that are your servants. Remember, this guy was a friend of the Jewish people. He understood about angels. He understood about the authority. If Jesus says the word, his authority was going to be enough to unleash the healing that needed to be done. And then Jesus responds. When Jesus heard these things, he was amazed by the centurion. He turned to the crowd that was following him and said, I tell you, I have not found in all Israel a faith so great as this. When those who were sent returned to the house, they found the servant restored to health. This is an amazing story because of how it demonstrates the humble heart of this centurion who did not consider himself worthy to even approach Jesus. Now think about this. He did not consider himself worthy to approach Jesus, and Jesus says, this is the greatest faith I've run into. Think about the difference. He considered himself unworthy. That's how he viewed himself. And Jesus said, this is great faith. What a contrast between what the elders were thinking, what the centurion thought, and then what Jesus concluded. So, we've got this gentleman living above Jesus' expectations. That's why he was amazed. He was pleased. He spoke about the man in glowing terms as having a great faith. And that introduces us to the whole topic of great faith and little faith. And most of the long-term members of New Dawn Community Church have heard me talk about great faith, little faith, because it's one of those core teachings that it's just something the Lord gave me years and years ago, and I take it around the world because it's so important for us to understand what it means to walk in faith, what it means to walk in great faith, and what it means to walk in little faith. These are key issues that we need to understand. Let me just draw on the centurion, and we'll talk about what qualified to be great faith on his part. And what qualified was that he lived above his level of experience of God. Let's face it, he grew up as a pagan, a Roman. He grew up under a system, whether he followed the Greek system or the Roman system, where all the gods are capricious. And they're mean, and they fight each other, and they torment humans. And there's really very little mercy, very little grace, and it was a horrible system. That's what he came out of. And as he approached Jesus, he demonstrated an understanding, a trust, a faith that was way above his level of experience. That's part of what a great faith is all about. Faith is living at your level of experience of God. The Lord doesn't give you tests above your faith. You never have a test come into your life that requires great faith. You only have tests that come into your life that require faith. Now, the problem is we don't like being consistent as human beings. And because we don't like being consistent, we would like to forget the ways that the Lord has treated us in the past so that we don't have to be responsible for the future. And you say, really? Is that how we are? Yes, that is how we are. If you've ever had any level of miraculous intervention by God in your life, it is only faith to expect that you will get that same type of miraculous intervention in the future. It is faith, not great faith. And if you don't live up to that, it's little faith. So let's say that you've had some financial issues and you suddenly get a miraculous intervention. If you now worry about your finances in the future, you are operating in little faith. Not great faith and not even faith. You're at the little faith level because you aren't living up to your level of experience of God. What's your level of experience of God? Your level of experience with God is that He intervenes in your finances when you ask Him to because He loves you. If you've ever been healed of anything by God, it is only faith to expect that when you war for your health that you're going to have breakthrough. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't come without some level of warfare. Of course it does. But we don't get into worry. Maybe God doesn't want to heal me. No, that's been settled. He already healed you once. He already intervened once. And that means it's only faith. Living up to your level of experience of God for you to expect that He will intervene again when you have need. And if you get into worry or doubt, that is little faith. By the way, little faith doesn't bless God. Faith pleases God, and great faith pleases God. We are called upon to live in faith. It's by faith from first to last. Here's the problem. We'd rather live in faith and then live by experience, but live under reality. And, it's not really how life works. When you drive over a bridge, do you get afraid? Some of you do because you don't like heights. But when you cross over a bridge over a canal in our town, do you ever think, oh my goodness, I wonder if it's going to collapse? Well, if you do, you probably got some anxiety issues that we need to deal with. Because most of us just take that for granted, don't we? Our experience is that when we cross over these bridges, they don't collapse on us. And so when we approach these bridges, we don't have anxiety. We just go right over the canal. We go right over the whatever it is that's out there because we just don't have that experience. Now, some of you have height issues, and when you get into some of these bridges we have that are way up in the air, you're a little anxiety-filled. But that's a different issue. See, that's how faith works. When you see God, He gives you experiences so you understand His promises are rock solid, and that means it's only faith from then on in to expect Him to respond in the same way every time. Okay? That's why Peter got in trouble. When he took that first step on the water, that was faith. Jesus had called him out. That was faith. Probably when he said to Jesus, well, he'd lived a lot with Jesus, so it probably only was faith. It probably wasn't great faith when he got out of the boat, although it's stunning faith to us. And when he stepped and the water's surface tension was enough to hold him up. You understand that was a miracle of surface tension, right? Okay, I mean, we do understand, hopefully, that there's a miracle of surface tension there because normally we understand how surface tension works. And there's a formula about how you break through surface tension. And so suddenly there was a change in the ability of the surface tension of the water to hold him up. And so he's walking on the water, and now he's walking in faith, and his level of experience of God is, well, I've taken 2 steps, I should be able to take a lot more, right? That's because he's walking in the miracle. His experience already is that he's walking on the water. This is incredible. But it turns into little faith instantly when he puts his eyes on his circumstance and lets his experience of God fade away. That's why right after doing this stunning miracle of responding to Jesus' words and walking on the water, Jesus can reach down and pull him back up and say, oh, you have little faith. Because he stopped living in his experience of God. He stepped into little faith. And that's how we are when we walk in little faith. Now, this centurion, he lived above his level of experience of God even higher than that. He hadn't had the experience of anyone ever giving a word and having the care and concern to heal his servant, but he drew some conclusions. And so he wasn't being presumption. He had reasons for what he was saying. He stated those reasons clearly. He says, if it works this way in my command structure, it's going to work this way in your command structure too. He drew conclusions based upon his experience. Jesus did the same thing in Matthew 6 when he was saying to the people, hey, oh, you of little faith, you worry about what you're going to wear, what you're going to eat, you worry about all those things, but consider the lilies, look at the birds. You've got experiences that should teach you about God's love for you, and you need to draw some conclusions just to live in faith. If you aren't, your experience is that God watches over even the most insignificant animals. And I don't think he thinks they're insignificant, but to us, and the flowers, well, you got to figure you're far more valuable than that. You should be able to draw some conclusions that are only faith. Because of your experience. Well, the centurion had never seen anything. Remember where he came from. He had never seen anything of the beneficence of God. And so for him to have this reasoned response about authority and the fact that Jesus was interested in doing it, that was way above his experience of God. Obviously, he also was very humble, and he was persistent as he went around and continued to ask for the healing of his servant, even as he was humble and saying, I don't deserve any of this. But he kept pressing in. Little faith, on the other hand, is a problem only for those who know God. You can't have little faith if you don't know God, because you don't have any faith. Even among those who should know better, the disciples are the perfect example of it, but I've already mentioned Matthew 6, the worry issue. Jesus looks at the people that should know better, who are under covenant, and say, oh, you have little faith. Fear, Matthew, Jesus is saying to the disciples, why did you think you were going to drown? You know what the disciples would have said? The disciples would have said, because we're fishermen and we have seen people drown like this again and again and again. It was rational to be afraid. But it wasn't faith. Their level of experience with Jesus already should have had them living in faith in the fact that the Father wasn't going to let him or them drown. So they were living underneath their level of experience. Matthew 14, the focus on the circumstances, that would be Peter. Not remembering past supernatural interventions. Matthew 16, when they didn't bring enough bread on the journey. And Jesus says, don't you remember about the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000? And you think I got a problem with lunch? Oh, you have little faith? And then in Matthew 17, they couldn't cast out a demon, and Jesus, that's after he'd given them authority to drive out the demon, and so Jesus said they had little faith. They weren't living up to the level of experience. So little faith is something, none of us want to aspire to little faith. We want to aspire to faith. And even to great faith if we can build a logical case for it. When God began using us to be able to, and he spoke to us, and that's what my book's about, and about the fact that he wanted to develop authority over hurricanes. Some of the things that we do now are based upon logical understanding. This is how he worked with us then, and it's reasonable for us to conclude, based upon that dynamic, that we also have authority in this area, and this area, and this area. It's what we do. You look at it and you say, what does that mean? Is this the only area the Lord wants to give us authority, or does he want us to have authority in other areas? And so you build the case for it. You have an experience with God, and then you build a case for what's going on next in your life. That's what great faith, little faith is all about. The centurion is the first one that introduces us to the concept of great faith. He does a great job, and he recognizes that Jesus has authority, and then we see it in action because the servant's health is restored. Jesus says the word, and the servant's health is restored. That's the Messiah responding to human need. There was a servant who was about to die, and the centurion cared enough about the servant to humble himself, to send a message to Jesus, and the Messiah responded to the need. Even though the centurion was misrepresented by the elders. If that centurion had heard what the elders said, he'd have went, oh no, it's ruined, it's ruined. But instead, his heart came out in everything that he did. So, next encounter that Jesus had is with a young man who had died in the city or village of Nain. This is verses 11 and 12. After this, Jesus went to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd were traveling with him. As they drew near the city gate, remarkably, a man who had died was carried out. He was the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. A notable crowd from the city was with her. So they were coming to the village or the city of Nain, and they got there, right at the time when this was happening. When you're going to the city gate, and then all of a sudden you have to get out of the way because there's a procession coming out, a large procession coming out, your timing was either very accurate or very poor because you couldn't get in the city. So they were at the city called Nain. A lot of people believe it was the city of Shunem, where the Shunammite was, where Elijah had healed her, or raised her son from the dead. And there's kind of a contrast. They really do believe. You can even see it in the roots of the words that Nain and Shunem, their roots are pretty close. So they believe it's in the same area anyway, but a lot of scholars are convinced it's the same city. It just had changed, its name had changed down through time. So after this, Jesus went to a city called Nain. Everyone was there. Oh, by the way, here's the picture of where it is. On the upper right or the middle of the screen, there's a circle, or not kind of a rectangle around the city of Capernaum at the north side of the Sea of Galilee. And then you can see Nain. It was about 25 miles to the southwest, about 6 miles southeast of Nazareth. So closer to Jesus' home grounds when he was growing up. But remember, they didn't travel far from their homes in those days. Everything was by foot. So he may never have been to Nain before, or he may have. Okay. Probably, for certainly in his travels, in his ministry, he had been there or around there. But now they were on their way to Nain because the Father had sent them there. It says remarkably. A lot of your translations drop the behold. If you have the King James Version, it says behold. Or it's usually behold. I try to translate with more up-to-date words than behold because it's really saying remarkably. There's this remarkable occurrence of events that you need to pay attention to. And it's remarkably. This thing happened. Jesus is going in. Here comes life and here comes death. And they have a collision. And that's really the whole point that Luke is making. That's why he uses the word that we translate behold or remarkably or pay attention to what I'm about to say or whatever. I try to make it more modern as I translate it. So as they draw near that gate, here comes this man being carried out, a young man. You can tell because of what Jesus said later and this whole story as it goes on. A man who had died was carried out. We don't know nothing else about him as far as how he died, why he died. Could have been, for obviously an accident or a disease, whatever. He was the only son of his mother. We get that. So that's a huge story right there. Because the fact that she it's her only son and she's a widow means this isn't just a personal loss and grief. She has now lost the ability to provide for herself. because women did not work in the marketplace. And when their husbands died or when they were divorced, that's why it says in, my mind's going blank on the Old Testament book. But anyway, in one of the scriptures in the Old Testament, by the way, the writer to the Hebrews did that. He said, somewhere it says, so I can do the same thing. Somewhere it says, Jesus says, I hate it when a man covers himself with violence toward the wife of his youth. I hate divorce. Okay? And you all say to me, what scripture was that? Yeah, Malachi. Thank you. I honestly couldn't remember Malachi. I can remember it's where the other scripture is that did I tell you how late I got in last night? No, I won't get into that. So anyway, oh, Lord, help the memory. Okay, anyway, in Malachi, God, it's because when you divorced your wife, you cast her out onto the winds of uncertain provision and circumstance, and basically the poor woman became a beggar and had to rely on the kindness of others in order to be able to provide for herself. In some cases, the woman had, the people with less repute would become prostitutes because they had no other way to support themselves. And so this woman, her only son, she was a widow, and it was her only son. And so this is a multiplied tragedy. It's not just, this is the grieving loss of a mom for her son, which would be tragedy enough. This was a tragedy because now everything about her life had changed, and she now had even no economic viability. And that explains the size of the crowd. The entire town entered in to the loss of social status and economic viability. Now, because they cared that much for her, they would have made sure she was taken care of without any doubt. But it was still a great tragedy, and everyone understood the situation. So it was, some of your translations say quite a number of, the crowd was quite a crowd. And it was a notable crowd that came walking out of the town. When it says that, it means it was bigger than the normal crowd that would be at a funeral. And funerals were put together quickly because of the climate in which they lived. They would normally just put the person on a bier, a carrying thing, and when you got a dead person on it, it's called a bier. And they'd put him on a carrying thing, and they'd take him out to wherever the burial place was that they were going to bury him. If they were around rock formations, you might be able to find a cave or something like that, or they would bury the person, in some sand or whatever. But they would make sure it got done. They would do up a little bit. They would often close the eyes, shut the mouth. They might have to bind up the mouth in order for there to be some dignity as they were carrying the person out. They might shroud the body. But for the most part, it was just very simple, and they would go out and they would do the burial. And so everyone was walking along. Death ran into life. When the Lord saw her, he was moved by compassion for her, and he said to her, "This is not the time for crying." He came up and touched the bier, and the ones who were carrying it stood still. Jesus said, "Young man, I say to you, wake up." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus returned him to his mother. We see compassion unleashed. Now again, Luke says remarkably, but Jesus only ever did what he saw the Father doing, so he knew the Father was going to name that day. And I don't know how Jesus heard exactly. I mean, he may have had dreams. He may have had things, where he's told in a dream, go to Nain. He may have, in his prayer times, heard the audible voice of the Father. We don't know. But whatever reason, he shows up at Nain at just that time as this funeral is coming out. And Jesus recognizes that this is an event that the Father has set up. And so he's going to take care of it. He says to the woman, this is not the time for crying. Now, I got to tell you just a quick story, a little excursus here, because this morning I'm looking at the normal translations for this section, and some of your translations will say, don't cry. Some will say, stop crying. And it sounds a little harsh, as Jesus is talking to her. And this morning, honestly, about 15, 20 minutes, I was praying about how to translate these words, because it's not as harsh. Jesus was not being harsh. He was filled with compassion for this woman. It says his heart was filled with compassion. But he's telling her, he's giving her a prohibition. He's saying, stop crying, but he's not really saying, stop crying. And how do you translate it? And so I didn't come with a whole real satisfactory way of translating it. And then Jacob's singing his song this morning. And he launches out into this. He wasn't singing the lyrics anymore. He was just started, crying out to God, and he sang over us, this is not the time for crying. And I'm sitting in back going, that's it! And So I told Jacob after he got off stage, I said, isn't it amazing you actually heard from God today, Jacob? It's awesome. I asked him, will you be upstairs or downstairs today? He says, I'm going to be upstairs. I said, okay, let me tell you what I'm going to say when we get to this section. And because of the fact that this really was, I knew it was a word from the Lord. The Lord was helping me through him singing. That's what Jesus was doing. He ran into this woman, and he just simply said, this is not a time for crying, and demonstrated why it wasn't a time for crying. In just a moment, it was going to be a time for celebrating. So it's like, that's a perfect translation for what it is that Jesus was doing. He walks up to it, because they're going to keep walking. If they don't know Jesus, they're going to keep walking. He just walks up and he put his hands on the beer. Now, by the way, that was you wouldn't normally do that. That makes you unclean, because there was a dead person on it. And so when Jesus walked up and touched it, it was either his authority or the unusual nature of it as he's talking to the mom got them to stop. They just stopped, and it might have been because he touched it from the front and they couldn't get past him. I don't know. That's one way to make sure they stop. His disciples behind him, they can't go anywhere else. But so he came and he touched the beer, and everyone stood still, even though, they were probably looking and going, what are you doing? You're going to be unclean. And then he looked at the young man. That's how we know he's really a young man. He's not an older gentleman who was the son of this widow. He was a young man. He says, young man, I say to you, wake up. Now, here's the contrast. This was a word of command. Remember when Elisha and the Shunammite woman came? And Elijah had the same issue when he was working with the Syrophoenician woman's son. They had to pray and go after God because their covenant was a different covenant. Jesus is teaching his disciples about the authority that those who walk in his covenant have. That's why we have the laws of sowing and not binding, but binding and loosing. Okay, we have those laws which are Jesus is teaching us about authority, and he's demonstrating authority here in the kingdom of God. And he just gives a word of command. He says, "Young man, I say to you, wake up." Now you know what everyone was thinking around him, right? He's not sleeping. Isn't this sad that this poor odd, preacher comes in out of the wilderness and the heat must have gotten to him? He's not sleeping, he's dead. Now, by the way, he's lying there in a shroud. He's probably got, even if he wasn't in a shroud, he's probably got his jaws bound up, and they've got different things. Sometimes they put coins on the eyes and everything like that. So he gets up and he walks up to the guy and he says, "Young man, I say to you, wake up." And right then, the dead man sat up, right before they dropped the beer. You can imagine. What would you do? You're the guy, especially in back. The guys in front holding the pole, maybe not, because they didn't know what was going on. They wouldn't know until the back poles went down. Because the guys who were in back went, "Ah!" What would you do? This guy was dead. It was obvious he was dead. He might even had a shroud over his head, and suddenly he gets up and he's talking. This had to just freak them out. This is a human moment. This is an amazing moment. We can't even understand the reactions of what is going on as the young man is getting up. He may have needed a back healing like you prayed for before after he went, boom! So. He got up and he began to speak. That was his evidence of life. And Jesus gave him back to his mother. He says, "Oh, by the way, that's why this is not a time for crying." What is it? It's a time for major celebration. It's a time to recognize that the Messiah is walking in your midst and God is visiting the people, and that there is so much power at his disposal. And obviously, by inference, as we read these scriptures, there's so much more power at our disposal. If only we will learn to walk in something besides little faith. When Jesus got done with the disciples in Matthew chapter 17, when they couldn't cast out that demon, he says, "When the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth?" There'll be plenty of little faith. And he didn't say, will I find great faith on the earth? He said, will I find faith? What that means to me is we don't really understand what it means to walk in faith on a regular basis. People get annoyed with me. I will admit that. And they get annoyed with me because I believe we have to press in and live in faith. See, our normal way of living is to live in a self-protective manner. which precludes the ability to walk consistently in faith. Do you know how much faith it takes to say to a centurion, "Great, no problem," and to turn and walk away and expect that the servant's going to be healed? Do you know what it takes to stop the beer and to say, I mean, if you're Jesus, it's he walked trusting that the Holy Spirit was going to back him up. Because he was as dependent upon the Holy Spirit as we are, because he set aside his divine prerogatives. He even though he was in very nature God, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped onto. He did not walk in this life as in his divinity. He walked in this life according to his humanity, and he took on the very form of a servant and made himself nothing and humbled himself to live exactly as he needed to live for us as one of us, so that his payment for us would count for us. And if he had cheated along the way, it would have invalidated the sacrifice, because he would not have lived perfectly as one of us. So when we look at this, there's more going on than just Jesus demonstrating that he's Messiah. He's demonstrating what true authority can do and reminding us that we have a way to go if we're going to walk in that type of faith. That's why he gives us the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will also be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will also be loosed in heaven. He's giving us something that is unleashed through faith. That's why it's from faith from first to last. One of the reasons we have so many testimonies here is to build faith, people's experience of God. Here's one of the things we know. If someone in this room gets healed of one issue, faith is engendered, and people will start grabbing onto it like crazy, and suddenly, because we have hope, and we say it happened for that person, and it'll happen for me. Because we want people to have faith. And so our whole job is to stir up faith. Remember that time that the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts is looking across the room, and he says it said that the man had faith for healing. You know what that meant? Paul didn't have to get over and yank him to his feet like Peter did when he did the guy outside the gate. Paul just had to look across the room. He says, "Oh, that guy's already got faith for healing. Get up!" Boom! He gets up. Because faith grabs onto the healing. Or faith releases the healing. Two people. Release, grabbing. Mutual actions. So as we see what Jesus did, it's like, wow. So what happened then? Then everyone was filled with awe and glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." This report about him went out through all of Judea and the surrounding region. So what happened is that Jesus does this thing, and you can imagine stuff like this doesn't stay quiet. Can you imagine what it was like when it got up to Nazareth, 6 miles away? Think about it. They tried to kill him. And they hear this report, that's got to be a difficult moment for the people that had tried to throw him off a cliff. That's a come to Jesus moment, literally. Okay, they're like, they have to hear it. You know, Jesus raised a guy from the dead. Oh, that's a little different. Anyway, this released awe and praise to God by the people who were there. Remember, there were crowds following him, and there were crowds coming toward him with the funeral procession. Lots of crowds, lots of witnesses. And so the word went out like crazy. They said, "A great prophet is walking among us." That was code for the Messiah. And God has visited his people, which is also code for the Messiah. And so there was a great deal of expectation being released. Next week, we're going to see that John the Baptist even hears this report, and then he sends messengers to Jesus to start asking him the questions about whether he is the Messiah or not. And we'll talk about whether John was doing that for the sake of his disciples or for his own faith. But we'll get to that next week. But the report went out so far that even John, in prison, heard the report and said to his disciples, "You go and check this out." For us today, we got some faith to live up to, I think. God really wants us to step into something. Here's the issue. Jesus said, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? I don't know exactly when Jesus is coming, but it's a lot closer now than it was back then. Wouldn't it be nice if we found faith on the earth? Because it's obviously important to him. And we want to lift him up, don't we? We want to lift him up. And we can do so by walking in faith. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for the opportunity today to be able to look at these sections of Scripture which remind us of how you respond to human need. I ask, Lord, that you would increase our faith to such a level that we can respond at the same way. There isn't a person in this room that hasn't seen someone who's sick or someone who has died and said, boy, I wish I could change that. Lord, I am asking that you would give us faith to be able to change things in this world. Because you walked in authority and have given it to us. I pray in your name, Jesus. Amen.